Today we're diving into the far future and deep in the underhive of planet Ravenholt to make some grimdark industrial factory terrain. We're going to be covering the creative process, assembling the raw materials, kit bashing them together, and finally giving it an epic paint job. To get some inspiration, I went online and looked at some stock images of abandoned factories, industrial settings, so-and-so, and I found a couple key elements across all of them. One was concrete. Poured concrete is ubiquitous in these factories. You can find it on the pillars, you can find it on the ground, you can find it on raised platforms, so I definitely wanted to have that. The second one would be steel beams. So these are the I-beams that you'd find holding up catwalks, holding up raised platforms, forming up the skeleton of factories. After that, no factory would be complete without pipes and catwalks. For the walkways, I'm using these aquarium gravel filters that I bought off Amazon. Cutting one of them in half here with a pair of tin snips. For the pipes, I'm using this kid's toy as well as some acrylic caulk tubing, and I found that the nozzle here, if you cut it off, it works as the perfect adapter to go from plastic tubing to the slightly large straws I have. We're going to use some chipboard or cardboard to make the I-beams. Easiest way I found to do this is just measure out one long board and then just cut. I'm doing 1/4 inch strips here, but you can do various sizes on your own. I told myself I would try and make these as neat as possible, and I had some time, so I decided to use PVA glue. This proved to be a terrible mistake because I couldn't get the darn things to line up and stay put for long enough to glue, so I ended up just using hot glue. That's all the I-beams done now. For the concrete pillars, I'll be using XPS Foam to make the rough outlines. First, cutting out rough shapes with a knife. If I like the look of how this turned out, I'll be making it into a template and cutting it on the hot wire cutter. You can absolutely just use a knife to cut these. I did have this hot wire cutter table, so I thought I would use it to make all of these cuts really quick. Now that I have the materials, it's a lot easier to envision the final product. I can come up with a rough dry fit before I glue everything together this way. You'll notice how none of it matches my original plan I sketched on the board itself. You just gotta let yourself improvise. Here I'm marking positions for the pillars, which I'll be anchoring with some toothpicks. From previous experience, just gluing the XPS foam that is smaller than 1 inch in diameter tends to be prone to breaking. For the overall design, I wanted to have 3 levels, so I'm setting up my pillars so that they can hold up a set of walkways at 2 positions. I haven't glued down any of the steel beams or walkways yet, since I want to seal the XPS foam and texture it separately. Here, I'm using a mixture of watered down Mod Podge and black paint, courtesy of Blackmagic Craft. However, I'm going to be doing things a bit differently than his technique. In order to get the concrete look and texture, I'll be adding in tile grout across the whole ground and pillars. I found that the texture of unsanded tile grout mimics that of hard concrete at this scale. It takes about a day to fully harden, but it's worth the wait. Next up, we're going to pick up some gray primer spray paint and give the whole thing a quick coat. Make sure you spray in a well-ventilated area and try and cover the pillars from all angles. I also took this chance to prime the circular tanks and smokestack with this oil-based primer. This stuff sticks to anything, and it also gives it an interesting texture. Here, I'll be detailing the large tank with some masking tape and various strips of cardstock taken from cereal boxes. The main idea here is to break up the plane shape, as most tanks of this size would not be made from one solid piece of metal. If you're enjoying the video so far, take a second to hit the like button, and subscribe if you want to get my videos suggested to you in the future. Once all this detail work is done, we're just going to prime it once more with gray and move on. Finally, it's assembly time. I'm taking the steel beams and gluing them down with some hot glue. You'll notice I also primed these ahead of time. When painting the final assembled product, I might not be able to get into all the nooks and crannies, so having them primed gray makes my life a lot easier. I decided the walkways looked a bit plain, so to switch things up, I'm gluing some cardstock on parts of them. It's starting to look really industrial now. Quick test for playability. Yep, confirmed, it's a walkway. To make the smokestack more rigid, I connect this elbow pipe coming out of the top of the main cylinder. I also add one to the bottom to act as drainage. I eventually want to add some stairs, so I'm adding this smaller set of electrical gang boxes to make it more accessible. This will go in the bottom right corner here. In order to have some consistency, I'll be gluing this smaller piece of gravel filter to serve as the walkway. I needed to cut some of these plastic pipes to size, but they are really hard to cut through with an Olfa blade. I had access to a copper pipe cutting tool. This can be found for cheap in the plumbing aisle of the hardware store. Turns out it can cut through plastic as well, just fine. Some of these thicker drinking straws make for great transitions between the thicker plastic piping. Just need to make an adapter. Pre-gluing this whole section that will attach to the side of the walkway saves me from having to assemble it as I go. Also, it lets me prime it separately. For the topmost walkway, I just added a piece of cardstock to the bottom. This saved me from having to cut more steel beams. Doing some final assembly here of the bottom walkway. For all the parts that touch the ground, I decided on using construction adhesive instead of hot glue for a stronger bond. I don't want these getting knocked over. Pro tip, if you're using a little bit of this glue at a time, use electrical tape to seal it off in between usages. I've been using the same tube for several weeks now, and it has not dried out yet. This pipe section was really annoying to glue down, and I ended up having to re-glue it after painting since it came loose. Now for adding some stairs. I took a steel beam and some walkway parts and started haphazardly assembling them until I got steps that were roughly 1 inch deep. I also built a small ladder going from the middle level to the main walkway. Now to build some more structured stairs. Starting with some chipboard, I measured out how far of a rise and run to go, and measured out 1 inch steps. From there, I cut out the profile of the stringer and duplicated it on another piece. Sometimes, you just have to use magic tricks when you run out of hot glue. Drywall mesh tape makes for great grating texture in a pinch. Ha ha! These stairs look a lot better than the ones at the bottom. On to painting. I first start by adding some homemade dark wash made from watered down black paint and inks. For the tanks and pipes, I use a leafy green as I wanted some variety from my usual gray and brown buildings. For the walkways, we're going to go straight back to a brown color. And finally back in with a fantastic red for the steel beams. The pillars and concrete floor are going to remain gray, but they're going to receive a lot of dark washes to make them look dirty and grimy, and also tie them in with the rest of the terrain. To add some weathering, I'm using a sponge and a slightly lighter version of the main green color to stipple a random pattern across the surface. Next, I'm coming in with a black paint on a fine brush and picking out parts of where I stippled with the sponge. This gives the effect of the paint having chipped and rusted off. Adding some very watered down orange paint with a thick makeup brush in all the dark spots make it look a lot rustier. This will dry out a lot less vibrant than it looks now. Finally, I'm coming in with a metallic copper paint on the walkways and a silver for the tanks and pipes. I still felt like something was missing, so I quickly glued up some railings out of chipboard and some toothpicks, and then I attached them to the parts of the model. These got a quick black paint and some metal dry brushing afterwards. For another quick bit of detailing, I drew out a stencil and cut it out from masking tape to add some lettering to the side of the large tank. I'm just doing one coat of white paint, careful not to glob it on too much. That way you can still see some of the weathering underneath. Peeling masking tape has to be one of the most satisfying things ever. Some other ideas for painted effects are hazard striping or adding some biohazardous symbols to the side of it. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You now get to look at the finished refinery and also decide which one of these videos you want to look at next.